We have a police commissioner that says he would go home to home and confiscate legally owned weapons if he got a tip. Madam Chair, I yield my speech, but I will not yield my opposition to these unconstitutional laws.
A congressman just described an America where guns were everywhere, homes had no locks, millions of combat veterans walked the streets, and somehow mass shootings did not exist. Nobody in that room could refute it. Stay with me until the end, because the answer to what changed is not what either side want to admit.
There was a lot of discussion about New York City. There is no discussion about gun violence in New York City without discussing the iron pipeline that is Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and honorary mention to Ohio, where 70% of likely illegal trafficked guns found in New York City come from. There's no discussion about gun violence in Chicago without talking about Indiana, because the violence and the mothers that we have to comfort are losing children due to the guns and the carnage and the lawlessness unleashed by those states. I move on. For context, the NRA spent about $250 million in 2020 alone. That's more than twice the entire salary of Congress combined in 1 year, lobbying against gun safety laws. There's also this discussion about anything but a gun, but that these are about violent people, but yet we aren't doing anything about addressing the actual root causes of misogyny, where 2/3 of mass shootings are connected to domestic violence, or the emergence of white supremacy radicalization, mass incarceration, and poverty, and the connections between that and mass shootings in our communities. I yield my time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm going to bring us back in time to World War II. America's population, 140 million. 15 million American men came home from World War II with deep scars and significant skills. They bore the invisible wounds of war. And there was weapons everywhere. We'll talk about mental challenge. My father was one of those men who was a Navy pilot in World War II. He came back from the war and built his family. I'm the 7th of his 8 children. I was born in 1961. We had guns everywhere. There was virtually no regulation. Any child in the 50s could buy a weapon from any seller if Daddy sent them with the money. We didn't have mass shootings. It wasn't until 1968 in America that serial numbers were even required on weapons sold in this country. You order weapons through the Sears catalog by the mail. In the 70s, I attended a high school, large rural school. Virtually every vehicle in the parking lot was a pickup truck, and almost every one had a rifle or a shotgun on the back glass and a pistol under the seat. And we didn't have school shootings. 1979, I began college. One of the jobs I had to work my way through college was as a carpenter. We restored historical buildings. We had to determine in the process of that work what was the original cuts of these homes, residential homes built 75, 85, 100 years ago. You could tell by the saw cut if it was a mechanical cut, an electric cut, or a hand cut. By such observations, we knew exactly how that house was originally built. And to my amazement as a young man, beginning college in Louisiana, working, to my amazement, you know what I discovered, Madam Chair? You know what these houses did not have that were built 100 years ago in cities in America? You know what they did not have, Commissioner? Locks. Locks. Now I ask you all, what happened to that country, man? A country where homes were built in cities with no locks. A country where guns were everywhere and virtually not regulated at all. where millions of Americans, 14 million Americans came back. It's 11% of the population at the time after World War II, with incredible skills of war and weapons of war, as you called them, everywhere. But we didn't have mass shootings. And here we sit today, where an entire once proud Democratic Party is presenting unbelievably unconstitutional laws to press upon our nation.
There is a question buried inside this debate that nobody in Washington has the courage to answer honestly. Not the side pushing for stricter laws. Not the side defending constitutional rights. The question is this: if the problem is the weapon, why did the weapon not produce the same problem 70 years ago when it was even less regulated and far more accessible? Clay Higgins did not just deliver a speech in that hearing room. He issued a challenge. And the challenge was not political. It was historical. Go back to the 1940s and 1950s. America had just concluded the largest armed conflict in human history. 15 million men came home carrying the psychological weight of combat, the muscle memory of warfare, and in many cases the actual weapons they had trained on. Guns were not just common in that America. They were everywhere, completely normalized, purchasable through a mail-order catalog, available to children if a parent sent them with the money. Serial numbers were not even required until 1968. And the mass shooting epidemic that dominates our national conversation today did not exist. That is not a political argument. That is a historical data point, and it demands an honest explanation rather than a political deflection. Now, the response from the other side of that hearing room focused on something called the iron pipeline, the argument being that strict local laws are undermined by more permissive laws in neighboring states, creating a pathway for illegal weapons to flow into cities with tighter restrictions. That is actually a coherent argument, and it deserves to be engaged with seriously rather than dismissed. But here is where intellectual consistency becomes the issue. The iron pipeline argument is structurally identical to the argument that has been made for years about porous geographic boundaries, allowing illegal movement of people and contraband across state and national lines. If the logic holds in one context, it holds in both. You cannot simultaneously argue that geographic enforcement gaps fuel a crisis when discussing one issue and dismiss the same logic when it is applied to another. Either borders and boundaries matter or they do not. Either you enforce a law where it is being broken or you accept the consequences of not doing so. What makes the Higgins speech so powerful is not the politics of it. It is the specificity. He was not trafficking in generalities or bumper sticker arguments. He was describing a lived reality with concrete historical detail. Houses in American cities built without locks. High school parking lots filled with pickup trucks carrying rifles on the back glass. A nation saturated with firearms and combat-trained veterans that somehow did not produce the crisis we are living through today. The honest question that follows from that historical picture is not about the weapons. The weapons were there. The honest question is about the culture, the community, the social architecture that surrounded those weapons and apparently contained the violence in ways that our current environment does not. Something changed. The weapons did not change in the direction that would explain more violence. If anything, the regulatory environment around them has become more restrictive over the decades, not less. So the variable that explains the change has to be found somewhere else. What changed was a connective tissue of American society. The institutions that once provided structure, accountability, and shared identity began to erode. Some of that erosion was natural, the consequence of prosperity and mobility, and the loosening of rigid social hierarchies that had their own serious costs. But some of it was accelerated by policy choices, cultural shifts, and the systematic dismantling of the local structures that once held communities together. The family unit as an institution weakened dramatically across several decades. The data on this is not partisan. It is demographic. Single-parent households, which correlate strongly with poverty, educational outcomes, and exposure to violence across every demographic group in America increased significantly from the post-war era to the present. This is not an argument about personal morality. It is an observation about structural conditions that affect outcomes for children regardless of anyone's intentions. Faith communities, which once served as a social infrastructure of neighborhoods across the country, declined in membership and influence. Those communities did not just provide religious instruction. They provided mentorship networks, dispute resolution, mutual aid, and a shared framework of accountability that extended beyond the legal system into daily life. Local civic engagement hollowed out. The organization, the local clubs, the neighborhood associations, the institutions that once gave ordinary people a sense of stake in their immediate community, declined as well. What replaced them was a nationalized media and political culture that gave people strong opinions about distant events while weakening their connection to the people actually around them. None of these observations belong exclusively to one side of the political debate. Scholars across the ideological spectrum have documented these trends. The disagreement is about the causes and the remedies, not the existence of the problem. What the hearing room demonstrated in the exchange between these two perspectives is that both sides are partially right and both sides are avoiding the harder parts of the conversation. Yes, illegal trafficking of weapons is a real enforcement problem that can and should be addressed through vigorous prosecution of existing laws. Yes, the cultural and social conditions that produce violence have deteriorated in ways that no single law can fix. Both of those things are simultaneously true. The reason Washington cannot solve this problem is not because the right answer is unavailable. It is because the right answer requires acknowledging things that are politically inconvenient for everyone involved. It requires enforcement that some find uncomfortable. It requires cultural conversations that others prefer to avoid. It requires admitting that the social contract that kept communities stable for generations was built on foundations that were deliberately and sometimes carelessly dismantled. Clay Higgins pointed backward to show us what was lost. The more important question is whether anyone in a position of influence has the seriousness of purpose to figure out how to rebuild it, not with nostalgia, but with honest reckoning about what worked and what we gave up when we stopped paying attention. That conversation is harder than any hearing. It is harder than any legislation. And it starts not in Washington, but in exactly the places Brian described, the school boards, the local precincts, the community organizations, and the decisions that ordinary people make every day about what they're going to tolerate and what they're going to defend. The guns were always there. What protected communities was never the absence of weapons. It was the presence of everything else. Hit that like button if this gave you something to think about, and subscribe so you never miss a conversation that actually goes beneath the surface.